The convocation of elder species had been sitting in judgment for 41,000 years. It met on the threshold, a station built from the compressed bones of a dead star, its outer hull older than most of the civilizations it had ever judged. The threshold did not orbit anything. It sat at a fixed point between three dead systems, connected to the rest of the galaxy by a single stable corridor that no petitioning species was permitted to use twice, once to arrive, once to leave, and never again unless summoned. This was tradition. No one remembered whether it had once been a warning. The amphitheater at its center could seat 1,000 delegations. It had been full perhaps 40 times in 41,000 years. Most hearings drew only the required tribunal and a scattering of observers from species with nothing better to do that century. The purpose of the convocation had not changed since its founding. A young species reached the stars. The convocation decided, formally and permanently, whether the galaxy would be safer with that species in it or without it. The standard was old, and the record was not kind. Of the 612 species that had petitioned across the convocation's history, 440 had been quietly unmade before they ever left their home system. Not through invasion, not through visible violence, but through 100 small interventions that added up to the same outcome. A supply chain that failed at the wrong moment, a political movement that succeeded at the wrong moment, a war that lasted 3 years longer than it should have. The elder species did not consider this cruelty. They called it stewardship. They had convinced themselves, across 41,000 years, that removing a fire before it became a wildfire was a form of mercy, and most of them had stopped examining that belief so closely that it might crack. 91 species had been permitted to join the wider community of the stars. 81 of those had not survived their first 1,000 years of membership regardless, swallowed by wars they hadn't started, diseases they hadn't been warned about, or simply the slow erosion of a culture asked to become something it was never built to be. 10 species remained. 10 out of 612 in 41,000 years. Humanity was petitioner number 613. Their file, when it arrived at the threshold, was unusually short. Most petitioning species arrived with volumes, genetic surveys prepared by their finest scientists, philosophical treatises on peace written by committees who understood precisely what was being measured and shaped every sentence to fit it, formal declarations translated into 40 tribunal dialects before a single delegate had read a word. Humanity's file contained a species summary 3 pages long, a technological timeline, and a short note in the margin, handwritten rather than transcribed, by the convocation's own archivist. Recommend extended observation period before formal hearing. There is more here than the summary allows. No delegate on the tribunal floor read past the 3rd page. If they had, they would have discovered a 4th page, sealed under archival protocol, that the archivist had chosen not to release. Not yet. The archivist had been waiting for the right moment for 2 months, watching the calendar, watching the delegate lists, watching one name in particular appear on the schedule for the opening session. Myra Voss was 34 years old when the selection committee chose her to speak for 11 billion people, and the reason given in her file was almost embarrassingly simple. She was the only finalist who had never once, across 400 hours of psychological evaluation, asked what would happen to her personally if the hearing went badly. Every other finalist had asked. It was a reasonable question. Myra had not asked it, and when the evaluators pressed her on why, she had said only that the answer wouldn't change what she did in the room, so there hadn't seemed to be a reason to spend time on it. The archivist, an elder species being named Threl Alm Vesic, a species that measured time in geological periods rather than years, and had therefore developed an unusual patience for reading things twice, had reviewed Myra's personnel file on the 2nd day after her selection was confirmed. The first read produced a result that seemed inconsistent with everything the convocation understood about how young diplomats were typically built. The second read confirmed it. Myra had served 4 tours in what her species called, without any apparent discomfort at the phrase, conflict zones. She had been present for 2 attempted planetary evacuations that were not, in fact, evacuations at all, but delaying actions dressed as evacuations, because admitting that nothing could be done was worse, politically and psychologically, than doing something and having it fail publicly. She had helped bury colleagues on 3 different worlds, using 3 different sets of local burial customs, because she had made it a habit to learn the customs of wherever she was stationed rather than import her own. None of this appeared in her official diplomatic credentials. Her credentials listed language proficiencies, negotiation certifications, and a commendation for a trade dispute resolved 11 years earlier that Threll suspected she barely remembered. The deeper record existed in a separate, harder-to-access file that Threll had requested out of simple curiosity and had not expected to receive in such complete form. Myra had not mentioned any of it during her arrival briefing. She had asked a single question, where her quarters were located relative to the tribunal chamber, in case she needed to move quickly, and had unpacked in 11 minutes. She had requested and received a full copy of Convocation Procedural Law, 700 pages long, and read it twice before the first scheduled session, annotating sections in a private shorthand that her aide later admitted she couldn't fully decipher either. She carried no ceremonial regalia into the hearing chamber. Most delegates wore something, a sash, a badge, an object meant to signal the weight of their office. Myra wore a single item clipped to her belt, a rescue beacon, deactivated, its casing worn smooth in places from years of handling. When a junior attaché from a neighboring delegation asked about it, curious rather than rude, Myra said only that it had belonged to someone, and that she carried it because leaving it behind would have felt like agreeing that it hadn't mattered. The attaché did not ask a follow-up question. Something in the way Myra said it discouraged one. She spent her first 2 weeks on the threshold doing almost nothing that resembled diplomacy. She walked the public corridors. She ate in the shared commissary rather than requesting private meals. She asked questions of station staff, logistics workers, maintenance crews, the people whose names never appeared in any tribunal record, about how the threshold actually functioned, who kept it running, what happened when something broke. Several delegations found this strange. Threll found it instructive. A species that sent its representative to learn the machinery of a place before learning its politics was, in the archivist's long experience, either extremely foolish or extremely serious. Threll had already begun to suspect which. The hearing chamber filled in strict order of precedence, which meant that Kaelvorn Thrace entered near the very front, because the Solvari delegation had held a permanent seat on the convocation for 11,000 years, and Kaelvorn was, by every metric his people respected, its finest current representative. He was young for his kind, barely 400, which among the Solvari was closer to adolescence than adulthood. But he had already argued for the formal dissolution of 2 petitioning species, and won both cases on the strength of a single technique, refined over dozens of smaller hearings. He asked questions that sounded generous, framed as curiosity, and were never generous at all. He had a gift for finding the one number in any species file that would let him end a hearing before the room's attention wandered, and he had built his entire reputation around deploying that gift in front of an audience that respected precision above almost everything else. Kaelvorn had reviewed humanity's public file the way he reviewed every young species file, quickly, efficiently, looking specifically for the number that would matter most. He found it in the technological summary. Humanity had achieved interstellar travel in under 400 years from their first documented powered flight. In the convocation's entire recorded history, every species that had crossed that same distance in comparable time had done so through violence, because violence was, historically, the only engine reliable enough to produce that kind of acceleration. War forced innovation. Innovation forced expansion. Expansion, eventually, forced a reckoning, which was precisely why the convocation existed at all. He discussed this openly in the delegate lounge before the session began, addressing a small cluster of aides who had, over several years of proximity to him, learned exactly when to laugh in his sentences, and exactly how long to let the pause after a joke sit before responding. He told them he intended to ask the human envoy a simple, friendly-sounding question. The kind of question a curious student might ask a new classmate, the kind that certain delegates asked specifically, because they had already decided quietly what the honest answer would prove. "It won't take long," he said. "These hearings rarely do once the right question is asked." Several of the aides smiled. It was a very specific category of smile, the kind that occurs in rooms where a hierarchy is being quietly reaffirmed before anyone has said a single formal word. It was not cruelty exactly. It was certainty, which was, in its own way, worse, because certainty didn't require anyone to feel guilty about what came next. Threll Almvesic, seated at the head of the tribunal table in the chair reserved for the archivist, said nothing throughout this exchange, though Threll's translator implant had picked up every word from across the lounge, a courtesy the Solvari delegation had apparently forgotten the archivist possessed. Threll had pulled the sealed fourth page of Humanities file 2 months earlier, on the second day after Myra Voss's arrival, and had been waiting patiently since then for the correct moment to release it into the formal record. Kaelvorn's confidence, Threll suspected, was about to manufacture exactly that moment. Threll did not smile. Threll had not smiled during a hearing in several thousand years. It had simply stopped seeming necessary. The gallery filled slowly behind the tribunal. Representatives from 4 other petitioning species, none of them scheduled to speak that day, had chosen to attend anyway. Word had spread, in the particular way word spreads on a station with very little to do, that the Solvari's rising star intended to make an example of the newest and smallest delegation. Watching a hearing collapse quickly was, for some species, a form of entertainment the convocation rarely offered. Myra Voss entered last, as procedure required for petitioning delegations, and took her seat at the small table reserved for humanity, a single chair, a single data slate, and the beacon clipped to her belt. She did not look at Kaelvorn. She did not look at the gallery. She reviewed the day's agenda on her slate with the same unhurried focus she had shown reading the procedural manual twice, and when the tribunal chair called the session to order, she looked up, and her eyes, which several delegates would later describe, independently, in almost identical language, did not appear to change expression based on what was happening around her, only based on what she was thinking. Kaelvorn waited until the formal opening statements were complete, until the procedural preliminaries had exhausted the room's patience just enough that a lighter question would feel like relief. And then he asked it, with the timing and tone of someone who had rehearsed the cadence in private, someone fairly certain of the room's reaction before the first word had even left his mouth. "Envoy Voss," he said, "your species reached the stars faster than almost any petitioner in this convocation's long history. We are simply curious, nothing more. How many extinction-level events has your species survived in living record since you began keeping such records at all?" The question was framed as trivia. It was not trivia. It was an accusation dressed as a number, engineered to establish, in front of an audience that respected precision, that a species moving this quickly through the dark had likely never been tested by anything larger than itself, and therefore possessed no true measure of its own limits. No humility, no scars deep enough to check its appetite once it reached the wider galaxy. A young, fast, untested thing, arriving hungry. Several of the aides in the gallery smiled again, the same smile from the lounge, now shared more widely across the room. Myra Voss did not smile, and she did not hesitate in the specific way that would have suggested she was calculating an answer designed to impress anyone. "That's a fair question," she said, in the tone of someone who genuinely found it fair rather than someone performing graciousness for an audience. "Do you want the ones we caused ourselves, or the ones that were caused for us?" Kaelvorn's expression shifted, not into concern, only into a small, visible recalibration. The look of someone realizing his question had a second door he hadn't accounted for opening in front of him. "The ones caused for you," he said after a beat too long. Myra said a number. The room did not react immediately. It reacted the way a wave reacts against a shoreline. The delegates nearest her first, a small ripple of stillness, then spreading outward through the gallery row by row, because the number she had given was not small. And it was not remotely close to what anyone in that chamber had expected a species this young to have survived even a single time, let alone the number of times she had just named without inflection, without drama, as though reciting a weather report. A junior Silvari aide near the back audibly exhaled. Somewhere behind the tribunal table, a delegate from an entirely unrelated hearing, present only as an observer, leaned forward for the first time all session. Kaelvorn opened his mouth to respond, found nothing immediately ready, and closed it again. Threll Alm Vesic stood, which the archivist almost never did during an active hearing, and formally requested permission to enter supplementary material into the record. Permission was granted quickly, mostly because no delegate present could think of a credible reason to refuse an archivist who had gone 41,000 years without once abusing that specific privilege. The footage that followed was not dramatic in the way a prepared presentation is dramatic. It carried no score, no framing designed to heighten tension. It was documentary. It was old, in places ancient, recovered from probes so weathered by time that the civilizations who had originally launched them no longer existed to claim credit. The first record showed a climate collapse, 7,000 years before humanity achieved orbital flight, triggered not by anything humanity had done, but by a terraforming trial conducted by an unrelated elder species 3 systems away. A trial that had gone wrong, been quietly abandoned, and never corrected. Humanity had not been told. Humanity had not been consulted. Humanity had simply lost roughly 40% of its population across 3 centuries, without ever learning that the disaster had a cause, let alone a cause with a name and an address somewhere in the stars above them. They had kept building anyway. Smaller settlements, colder climates, fewer resources, no knowledge of why any of it was happening, and no expectation that an explanation would ever arrive. The second record documented a targeted culling attempt roughly 4,000 years later, carried out by a since-collapsed elder species civilization known as the Ashven, who had detected humanity's early radio emissions and classified them, in their own recovered archival language, as premature noise requiring correction. The correction took the form of an engineered pathogen, delivered by an unmanned probe designed to look, if discovered at all, like a natural meteor impact. It had not worked as intended. The pathogen mutated into something less lethal on contact with Earth's biosphere, and the resulting outbreak, while devastating, had not achieved its designer's goal. Humanity never learned an attempt had been made, until the Ashven's own records were recovered centuries later by a completely different species, and eventually cross-referenced by Threll during a routine archival sweep that had, at the time, seemed entirely unremarkable. The third record, quieter than the first 2, showed a resource war fought entirely between humans, over the last viable farmland on a dying regional world, ending not in treaty but in exhaustion, 3 years before Myra's second deployment. She had not needed to review the footage closely. She had lived adjacent to its aftermath. Several delegates in the gallery noticed for the first time that she had gone very still watching it, though her expression remained unchanged. The fourth record showed a pandemic, naturally occurring this time, that had swept 3 continents in a span of 18 months and killed, by the most conservative estimates in the file, more people than any single war in humanity's recorded history. There was no villain in this record, no elder species intervention, no engineered cause. Only a species that had, in the space of a generation, built the infrastructure to identify the threat, race to counter it, and rebuild what it lost, all without any external help arriving, because none had been offered and none had been expected. The 5th record, the one that made the chamber fall fully silent rather than merely quiet, documented a near-miss asteroid deflection using technology humanity should not, by any standard convocation model of technological progression, have possessed for at least another century. The deflection had worked. No complete record existed of precisely how. Threll's own annotation in the margin of the sealed file read simply, "Method unverified, outcome confirmed, recommend further study." By the 8th case study, 3 more had followed, each smaller than the last but no less unsettling in aggregate. Cailvorn was no longer smiling. He was watching the footage with the specific, quiet expression of someone performing a calculation that was clearly going to take considerably longer than the remainder of the session to finish. Several times he opened his mouth as though preparing an objection, and each time closed it again, apparently unable to locate a version of the objection that wouldn't make things worse. Myra did not speak once during the entire presentation. She watched the footage with the rest of the room, her hand resting lightly on the deactivated beacon at her belt, her expression unreadable in the specific way that meant she was not performing anything for the chamber's benefit. She had lived through fragments of this. She had buried people connected to fragments of this. The room's shock was new to everyone else in it. It was not new to her, and it did not appear to bring her any satisfaction to watch it unfold on their faces. Threll let the silence hold for a long moment after the final record concluded, before speaking again, this time without footage, without further notes, simply addressing the chamber directly. "There are 11 more incidents catalogued in the sealed file," Threll said. "I have chosen not to enter them into the formal record today, because I do not believe this chamber requires 11 more examples to understand the pattern that has already emerged. I would instead ask the tribunal to consider a different question than the one Delegate Cailvorn originally posed. Not how many disasters this species has survived. Ask instead how many of those disasters they survived without ever learning who, or what, had caused them, and continued moving forward regardless, on the working assumption that the universe owed them nothing, and that they would proceed without its help either way." No one in the chamber offered an answer. The silence that followed was, itself, the only answer the room was capable of giving. A delegate from one of the observing petitioner species, a small, quiet being from a species called the Avrin, seated near the back, was later reported to have said, quietly, to the colleague beside her, "We asked for permission to exist. They never even thought to ask." The session adjourned without a formal vote. Threll requested a recess of 3 days before any tribunal decision would be entered, citing the need for full review of the supplementary material. Though privately, Threll suspected the delay was less about procedure and more about giving the chamber time to finish recalculating everything it had assumed walking in. Cailvorn Thrace remained in the chamber long after most of the gallery had filtered out, reviewing his own notes in silence, crossing out lines he had prepared for a rebuttal that no longer applied to the conversation that had actually taken place. When Myra finally rose to leave, gathering the single data slate from her table, he stopped her at the chamber door. "The number you gave me," he said, "and the number in the full file, they are not the same." "No," Myra said. "They're not." "By how much?" "By a lot," Myra said, without elaboration and without any visible satisfaction in saying it. Cailvorn did not press for the exact figure. He nodded once, in the manner of someone quietly updating an internal ledger rather than conceding a public debate, and turned to leave. He was not humiliated in the way the gallery might have expected, and he did not offer anything resembling an apology. He was recalculating, and recalculation for a being like Kael'vorn would take considerably longer than a single afternoon. At the very edge of the doorway, he paused a second time, without turning back. "I still believe fast growth is dangerous," he said. "I am not certain anymore that danger is the same thing as a lack of restraint." He left without waiting for a response, and Myra did not offer one. She had not come to the threshold to win an argument about Kael'vorn's worldview. She had come to answer a question honestly, and the rest, as far as she was concerned, was his to work through. Myra gathered the last of her materials from the tribunal table, the data slate, nothing else, and reattached the rescue beacon more securely to her belt, out of old habit rather than any real necessity. She did not linger to watch the chamber finish emptying. The hearing was finished. There was other work waiting on the station, minor logistics questions she'd promised to help a maintenance crew resolve, and she had never been someone who lingered over finished things. Threll Almvesic caught her at the corridor threshold before she reached the lift. "You did not ask me why I waited to release the file," Threll said. "I assumed you had a reason," Myra answered. "I did. I wanted the chamber to hear your answer before they saw the evidence behind it. I wanted them to notice that you did not know the number would impress anyone. You simply knew the number, the way a person knows their own address. Most petitioning species come to us hoping to be admired, envoy Voss. You answered a difficult question as though being believed had never once occurred to you as something you needed to earn." Myra considered this for a moment, the way she considered most things offered to her, without hurry, without performance, turning it over fully before responding. "We weren't trying to impress anyone," she said finally. "We were just trying to still be here tomorrow. Being believed came later if it came at all. Some days it still hasn't." Threll studied her for a long moment, then opened the Convocation's permanent assessment ledger, the same record that had, across 41,000 years, quietly decided the fate of 612 species before hers, and wrote 3 words beside humanity's entry, in the space reserved for a tribunal's private, unofficial conclusion, days before any formal vote would ever be cast. Already ascending. Threll closed the ledger and did not show it to Myra, and did not need to. Some records were not written to be read by the people they were written about. They were written to be true regardless. The formal vote, when it finally came, took less time than the hearing that preceded it. 9 votes in favor, 1 abstention from a delegation that had not yet finished reviewing the sealed file in full. No votes against. Kael'vorn Thrace was not among the 9. He was also not among those opposed. He abstained as well, quietly, without explanation offered to the chamber, though he sent a private message to Myra's terminal later that evening. A single line unsigned, that she read once and did not respond to. "I would like to know the other 11, when you're willing to tell me." Myra did not answer that night. She sat in her quarters on the threshold, the beacon unclipped from her belt and resting on the table beside her, and looked out at the dead star the station had been built from, and thought, not for the first time, about how strange it was that a species could spend its entire history assuming it was alone in its suffering, only to learn at the very end of that history that it had never once been unwitnessed, only unanswered. Unwitnessed, only unanswered.